Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. This is part 2 of our examination of Catherine the Great of Russia, her life and her accomplishments. We talked about how she came to power, she came to Russia, German princess, she replaced her husband on the throne, organized the coup d'etat, started the series of charters to nobility, charters to the cities and all this, and then finally division of Poland and the Turkish War. This is what we've covered in the first part. Now let me focus on her domestic situation, how she ruled and what she did accomplish. Catherine was a very clever woman, and she understood that the only reason that she could rule is if she does have support of the nobility, because there's no other political force. The merchants, as I say, are pretty much rich peasants who have no interest whatsoever in ideas of Voltaire or Enlightenment. So she had to please them in some way, and she did please them by new territories, by new acquisitions, by privileges of all kinds. And she did play one faction against another, and she was brilliant in this. And she, of course, had lovers. Count Orlov was her lover, and she used her bed as a kind of a place for favorites, who then would report to her what the condition of the army is and who is with her, who is against her, and she kind of used her position as a woman to like French kings had lovers and they had no input in politics except Madame de Pompadour, but she used her lovers as also statesmen, as people who would be having political authority and political power, and who would be her generals or her prime minister or something like that. I think the relationship with Orlov was the longest one, and she did love him, it seems, and she built a beautiful palace for him right next to the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. So this is how she ruled. She manipulated different factions of nobility and then maintained herself in power by this way. Now, her reforms. One of the reforms she did was administrative reorganization of Russia, which is called the provincial reform. Russia was reorganized into what is called in French gouvernement, or in Russian governments, but actually it's provinces. So each province would have a capital, would have administrative bureaucrats collecting taxes and so forth. So this was much better than the chaos of preceding administration. She established Russian Academy of Sciences, which of course is a great step forward. She was a great supporter of education. She established for the first time the Smolny Institute for noble girls. So mimicking the same kind of institution in France, she established the first higher education for women, for girls of nobles. So that existed all the way into the 20th century, this institution. Well, of course, she also built the magnificent Hermitage Museum, which Hermitage means a place to be alone, and she built the magnificent Winter Palace, some of which some of you are going to see when we go to St. Petersburg. So it is truly a remarkable, beautiful palace. An even more beautiful one is in the suburbs, which is called the TSAR'S village, or the town of Pushkin, where I hope we'll go to, and that's even more magnificent. Probably, I would say, more beautiful even than Versailles. So it's absolutely magnificent palaces. And in the Hermitage Museum, she begins to collect, something that would grow to be the second or the third largest museum in the world today. So this is the Hermitage Museum after the Louvre and the British Museum. Some people say it's even better and bigger in terms of its holdings. So this is what her did. Now, she also introduced in the Academy of Sciences, there's more than just that it's Academy of Sciences. She actually established a commission anything that she would need to do, she would do is Germanic way. There'll be a commission set up, and the commission would study the problem and then would define a solution. So that would reform the Russian language. And all the people who worked on it were the German linguists. And this is why Russian grammar of a modern Russian is so different than it was in the Middle Ages, and is so similar to German. In fact, it's very easy for the Russians to learn German because grammar is virtually the same. And I had no problem learning German because it's so similar. Oh, the words are different, but the structure of the language, the way you compose sentences, all kinds of things are very Germanic. So then, basically, her approach to government was to make what Joseph would call it a Rechtsstaat, which means a state based on law. And she would, generate all these laws, and she would not want any more experiments with the parliament or with the representative assemblies. No, she was a firm believer, like Joseph, in autocratic rule. She was convinced that Russia could be changed for the better by enlightenment and by a firm hand of the Tsar. So the spreading of schools was her idea. The hospital, the universities, the Academy of Sciences, all of these definitely are her great accomplishments. Now, there's also a Pugachev rebellion that needs to be mentioned in the context of her reign. Now, Pugachev was a leader of a peasant rebels out on the Volga basin, and they did rise in rebellion because indeed the condition of peasants was becoming worse. This is one of the so-called bad stuff. This is the bloody side of her. I mean, the rebellion was crushed. Troops were sent, and he was captured and quartered and brought in a cage to St. Petersburg, and it was a pretty messy story. But Pugachev rebellion also is very important because it kind of generated a myth in Russia of freedom that would come one day, and a kind of a rebellious spirit of running away to the wilderness of the East. So if in the United States you have the West as a spirit of freedom and wilderness where you could run away. In Russia, Serbs would run away to the East, to Siberia, or to the Cossack lands. And so the Pugachev, to the present day, there are songs that are sung in the folklore celebrating that kind of a freedom of peasants running away to the open frontier and being a free Cossack. So this is one of the things that she did. Now, she, as I said before, did try to introduce her greatest accomplishment. Really, is not necessarily only the Academy of Sciences and the schools and stuff. That she did introduce. This is my view: legal culture to Russia. Legal culture meaning she introduced the principle that laws are important, and that if you want to resolve something, you do it in a civilized manner, which means you assemble a commission of experts and you elaborate a law that would address this issue. And to many ways, I think it's the way Russia is to the present day. Putin would act in the same way. There will be a commission, there will be a resolution, and they will find a problem, not necessarily through debate in the Congress that leads nowhere, as in the United States today, but by a committee of experts. So a kind of an enlightened autocracy in the sense that there's absolute ruler who collects the views of all the important experts and then finds a solution. I think this is probably her greatest contribution in creating this kind of a regular law-based government in Russia. Now, finally, interesting point. When Voltaire died, she she sent people her instructions to a Russian ambassador to pay whatever it takes, whatever amount of money is required to buy his entire library and all his manuscripts and everything. and they did. So now Voltaire's library is in Russian Academy of Sciences. As I mentioned before, she didn't invite Diderot to come to St. Petersburg, and he did stay for 2 years. In case of Calas, you remember the Huguenot guy who was executed in France? She did send money, like Frederick the Great. So she was totally, involved in European affairs. She was a Russian empress who was a European and who was German and who read everything, was aware of everything, was totally committed to being a part of European culture. And this is also her contribution. Russian culture does begin to be European, even more so than under Peter the Great. It is under her watch, in her 330 years of her rule, that Russia does begin to acquire what we would call civilization. In other words, Russian writers appear, Russian music appeared, the Russian scientists appear. I mean, none of that existed. Russia didn't have any scientists, didn't have any poets, didn't have anything. It was a peasant society with a czar and the boyars. That was it. Peter just began it all in a stormy way. But now Russia does begin to have educated society. And they begin to speak French. And by the end of her reign, everybody speaks French. If educated nobility in their parlors in St. Petersburg, they do continue to speak French. As being born in St. Petersburg, I tell you, one of her greatest accomplishments is that she made it even more beautiful than Peter. Peter began, but she continued. And it is the Winter Palace, and it is the Tsarist village, and it all these beautiful embankments and avenues and parks and the Hermitage. I mean, that is, she did kind of launch St. Petersburg on what you will see is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, definitely. Comparable to Vienna, Paris, and Berlin before the Americans destroyed it in World War II. So yeah, that's what makes her great. She's remembered mostly for the win in the Turkish War for Crimea, but more subtly, her contribution is that she made Russia modern. She made Russia civilized. She made Russia more European and more cultured, more progressive, and more lawful. And in that sense, she does qualify to be called Catherine the Great. Thank you. And don't forget to tell your friends to subscribe to Dr. Brovkin. And tell all their other friends to subscribe to Dr. Brovkin so that we can reach 1,000 subscribers. Thank you.